Okay, so welcome to the Evolution Seminar Series. We're going to wait a few minutes as the attendees start to roll in. Okay. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's my great pleasure to introduce Blaine Schubert, who is a professor in geological sciences and director of the Center for Excellence in Paleontology and Gray Fossil Site at East Tennessee State University. His research is extremely diverse and includes a study of dental microwear on bovids from South Africa, the focus of his dissertation, to numerous microwear projects we've collaborated on, including saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant short-faced bears. He is known as one of, if not the world's expert of giant short-faced bears. He is currently working on giant short-faced bears from the Yucatan of Mexico and their important biogeographic implications. Dr. Schubert has worked on everything, including lizards, dinosaurs, and mammals, describing new species to interpreting their paleoecology. Blaine Schubert also has an IMDb page, and this is for actors, due to his appearance on Monster Quest and Jurassic Fight Club, which are really fun. Blaine Schubert received his PhD from the University of Arkansas under the mentorship of Dr. Peter Unger, and then moved to Tennessee in 2004 as a postdoctoral fellow at the Gray Fossil Site, and later became faculty there in 2006. Since then, he has developed a top-notch paleontology program at ETSU. Here at Vanderbilt, we have really enjoyed our relationship with ETSU and the Gray Fossil Site. We frequently visit the site for educational purposes, and several students have been out to the field to Saltville, Virginia with Dr. Schubert to help dig up mammoths, or maybe they're mastodons, I can't remember. And well, we have also assisted several of their students in laboratory analyses of stable isotopes and dental microwear. During COVID, he kept extremely busy launching a new seminar series called Paleo Talk. It's available on YouTube and also Facebook Live. They have just completed 20 episodes and they air on Fridays at 11. It's a really fun series, and I highly encourage any of you to check that out as well. This has been a long-awaited talk as we sort of are getting the yin and the yang. Dr. Schubert was actually here at Vanderbilt ready to give a talk, and then a snowstorm came through and he had to leave right before the seminar to make sure he got home safely. So finally we get to actually see his talk, and without that, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Blaine Schubert, who is a wonderful colleague and also a friend.
All right. Thank you, Larissa, for that introduction. I had no idea about that site you were talking about, that I'm on an actor's page apparently, but I definitely wouldn't include that on my resume. If we talk about the Gray Fossil Site, and that's the topic, I like to refer to the Gray Fossil Site as extraordinary, because it truly is extraordinary, not only in a regional perspective, but also in a worldwide scale perspective, in that it is truly unique in what it captures in both the fauna and the flora. It's a time frame about 5 million years ago that we just don't have well represented from other fossil sites representing this type of environment. So when I came to Tennessee in 2004, we didn't have this building yet. This is where we have the Natural History Museum, this structure here, and we're up in Northeastern Tennessee, and it's built right on the fossil site itself. And from this site, we get extraordinary animals. We get things that you would not expect at all, like red pandas. And I'm going to talk a little bit about red pandas as we move forward. And we're going to look at the excavations and how we excavate. We have, even though we've been working on this site, or at least I should say it was discovered in the year 2000, this site has only been excavated at about 2% still. So the site is huge, over 100 feet deep, around 5 acres in its overall extent. Just enormous. You can see the surface here and then digging down into this dark colored clay. And so eventually what we do is we develop what's called the Center of Excellence in Paleontology that is building up this paleontology program at East Tennessee State University. And that's what we have. So to zone in on our location, we're in Washington County, almost in Virginia, almost in North Carolina, 30 minutes pretty much to either of those states. So in the Appalachian region, but not that far from Nashville or Knoxville. And the discovery of the site in 2000 was one of luck. And as many paleontological sites are found, this one was found during road construction. So if we look at this aerial view, and this isn't that far off of Highway 26, if you're traveling up 81, you can hit 26 to take it towards Johnson City and Asheville. And at that point, you'll cross over 75. And 75 actually will take you out along here. This is 75. And the way that this site was discovered is that there was a hill, basically right here, and this road came over the top of this hill to a stop sign. And there were some bad accidents that had occurred right here where this stop sign was. So they decided to cut down through the hill. And in that process, they dug through this orange overlying clay and hit this gray clay. And that came with two problems. One, the clay, they weren't sure if it was good to build on top of because of the plastic nature of that clay. But they also noticed, the construction workers also noticed that there were bones in it. And if you're a construction worker, you're not necessarily going to notice small bones. But the bones that they were able to see, that were so easy to see, were elephant-sized bones, which we do have an elephant-sized animal. And then as they got down and started looking closer, they found many other animal remains. And originally, when it was discovered, archaeologists from UT started coming up, UT Knoxville. And originally it was thought to be an Ice Age site. So here we have another view of it. You can really see that hill. And then here's 75 highway. Here's where we're cutting through and hitting that gray clay. Again, it's about 4 to 5 acres and around 100 feet deep from the top of the deposit down to the bottom. And that depth is based on cores that were done. And you can see that as they were doing this construction, not only were they hitting the gray clay here, but they were also hauling that gray clay out for a little bit and even dumping it on to other parts of the site. One of the things that I often get asked when I talk about the gray fossil site is, are you still digging out there? Or how long do you think it's going to take to dig it all up? And really, in most cases, paleontology, we're never having a goal of digging the entire thing up. But we used to say, just to sort of answer the question, well, it's going to take 100 years or hundreds of years we'll be busy working here. And then one of our geologists actually calculated the basin and the amount of sediment in that basin, and then the rate at which we're excavating. And he came up with 16,600 years approximately to be excavating the gray fossil site if we really were to excavate the entire thing at the rate we're going. So this is basically the perimeter of the gray fossil site. We draw a line around it. This is now where our museum is, and you can see it looks like it's sitting right on top of the road. But realize, not only did the highway department stop this road construction project and save the fossil site and build a natural history museum, they also rerouted this road to come out around here, bought that property, and moved this house actually back in that entire process. So it was a huge expense to actually save this fossil site, and it's sort of a Cinderella story in a preservation of antiquities. And it was protected under archaeological protection. Even though it's not an archaeological site, in the state of Tennessee, the fossils fell under an archaeological site and they were saved that way. Now, if we look here, what I want to show you is areas where we have found fossils. All of these little green dots actually represent fossils that have been mapped. So green dots all over the place. You can see that we even found fossils underneath the museum. So this is post-museum building. So that original road used to come right through here, right through where the building is now. And when we were getting ready to put in the building, we found a lot of fossils right underneath it. We didn't actually have a choice in where the building was going to go. So we had to be out there with the heavy equipment, finding and removing those bones. And for all of the sediment that was excavated from underneath the building before they put in the foundation, we had them dump the sediments actually back here. So this is an area that we call the spoil piles. Piles of sediment that came from underneath the building. So those are not areas where we've actually excavated in situ material. That's where we've watched material weather out that originally came from underneath the building. And I'll come back to that in a minute when I talk about an important red panda skeleton. So it was a lot of these areas that were already exposed or close to the surface and where bone was weathering out. And it's because of that that we've focused primarily in those areas. But the fossil site does extend way down into this area as well. But the primary areas that we've focused is where those bones were weathering out, and the fossils have been quite rich there. Here's our parking lot. We actually have an additional building or an annex right here. And our property line is this red outline. Just to zoom in on that so you can see it a little bit better. These bones down here are actually from that sediment that was originally dumped by the road construction crew down here. So we wanted to see if we could find some of those sediments. I want to put this into a geological perspective in terms of time. A lot of us aren't used to thinking about geological time. And so what this geological time scale does is it's oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top. And it allows us to sort of look at this in a perspective of all of these different time units. And we're going to talk now about ones that we see particularly in Eastern Tennessee. So in Eastern Tennessee, we have a lot of Paleozoic sediments, and it's the same in Central Tennessee as well. So those cave deposits, those limestones, dolomites, and sandstones that we'll see driving up across the plateau, these are Paleozoic rocks, and Paleozoic rocks across a lot of Eastern Tennessee until you get up farther into the Appalachians where you get into some older rocks. But basically, if we're going to look for fossils, we're mostly going to find Paleozoic fossils from when oceans used to cover this part of the world. So we're sort of restricted to those Paleozoic invertebrate fossils. And then there's this huge gap in time where we really don't have a good record of fossils in Tennessee, unless you're in Western Tennessee, where you can find some of these Mesozoic deposits from an ancient seaway that was over there. But we have this huge gap in time over in Eastern Tennessee, where if we want to look at fossils, we're either looking at Paleozoic or we're looking at Ice Age fossils from the Pleistocene, sites like cave sites or Saltville up in Virginia that have mammoths and mastodons and giant short-faced bears. And so when we get the gray fossil site, we are, for the first time, not only in Tennessee, but for the Appalachians in its entirety, from Georgia all the way up to Maine, and this whole region, basically recording a site that's 4.5 to 7 million years old. And not only that, but we're recovering this site that represents a forested environment, which we really don't get at other localities in North America. So it's incredibly unique and has lots of surprises. So if we look at the age of the fossil site, a couple of the animals early on that were used to help us age the site is our little short-faced bear, a bear that would be a little smaller than a black bear, and rhinos. So rhinos are not something we typically think about in North America. Teleoceras is the genus of our rhino, and Pleonarctos is the little bear that we have. And what we can do, even though we don't have a way of getting an exact radiometric date on the site at this time, we can look at the evolutionary history of these animals. And what we can see is that Teleoceras, this group of rhinos, well, they go extinct about 4.5 million years ago in North America. They basically disappear from the Americas at that time. So out west, where they can be dated, and they have been dated using radiometric techniques, that's when they disappear. So we could say, you know, our younger end of our site is maybe 4.5. And this bear shows up in the fossil record at other sites around 7 million years ago. And so we were able to bracket the age of the site early on between 4.5 and 7. And we'll talk a little bit about how we've been able to refine that age. Now, the site is not only significant because of the animals, but also because of the plants. Most fossil sites that have plants don't have animals and vice versa. And so it's rare where you get the preservation of both plants and animals from a site. And this gives us a relatively complete forested ecosystem that we can look at here in North America that we're really not getting at other places. So oak, hickory, pine, basically very similar to today, but with some Asian affinities. Now, looking at gray as this sort of isolated occurrence for this time frame, when we look at other sites geologically in age, they're essentially within this area. So other latest Miocene, early Pliocene sites are located primarily along here. And these are mostly open plains and prairies type of sites. So we get a really different group of plants and animals recorded. Now, recently, I should mention that there are actually 4 of us paleontologists that are here at ETSU. Steve Wallace was the first one. In addition, we added Chris Widga, Dr. Chris Widga, and Josh Samuels a few years ago. And one of the things that Josh Samuels did is he started looking at a lot of our small mammals and our mammalian fauna overall. So not just the rhinos and the bears, but based on some work that we had done, some collecting, heavy collecting that Steve Wallace and I had done from a National Science Foundation grant, and screen washed that material, we started getting all of these other animals. And after we had all of these other animals, what we were able to do, and he led this work, is to bracket the age of the site in a more tight fashion. So what we're looking at is first appearance datums and last appearance datums, fads and lads. So when did things appear? When did they disappear? Or is it within the range? And in doing that, we come up with about 4.9 to 4.7 million years for the age of the fossil site. So we're narrowing it down from 4.5 to 7 to between 4.9 and 4.7, or we could just say around 4.8 million years ago. So overall, and I'm going to specifically talk about the animals because that's my area of expertise. But again, we have really well preserved plant material as well. Everything from pollen to leaves to seeds to nuts. We have all of these different types of plants, and we have people working on these. But we have everything from fish, salamanders, frogs, turtles, snakes, lizards, even alligators, birds, and mammals from the site. And what we're seeing right here is actually a fish skeleton. So here's the back of the fish, here's the head of the fish, here's the mouth of the fish. This was one of our best preserved fish skeletons, actually, and it was found during the construction project phase. Now, as you do paleontology and as you build exhibits, one of the things that you do is you work with paleo artists to reconstruct the animals that are represented. And you can see some of those animals here: shrews, moles, bats. Well, none of those show up in these pictures, but our ground sloth is here. It's not a very big ground sloth, but one of the animals that we were finding and had been found early on was a proboscidean, or an elephant-like animal. And again, we'll come back to that in just a minute. But you can see that I have a question mark on it. We originally had this identified as a shovel-tusked elephant, and that ID goes all the way back to some of the UT professors that had found some of those remains. But we're going to see in just a minute that we have another type of proboscidean. We have a little bit of horse. We have lots and lots of tapir. We have one species of horse, one type of tapir, one type of rhino, at least 3 types of peccaries. We have camel here, saber-toothed cat, but not very much. We have a little short-faced bear. We have a type of red panda. We have Eurasian badger, and many, many more have been added to this list. This is sort of a standard excavation. This is what's called the rhino pit. Larissa dug with us, with her students in this exact area, and worked on many of the tapirs that have been found from this site. But we dig in sort of standard archaeological style, keeping our levels, and we collect all of the sediment, and we actually screen wash all of the sediment. Another amazing aspect of this fossil site is that a lot of the remains are still articulated, meaning that the bones are still in the original position of when the animal died, when the animal sunk to the bottom. So here you can see a part of a humerus, the ulna radius, the carpals, the metacarpals, moving on down. So tapir legs are everywhere. We have so many tapirs from this site. So getting fieldwork experience is something that we offer to students and volunteers from all over. So if that's something you're interested in doing, let us know. But once you excavate something, that is really just the beginning of dealing with it. Realize that once it goes into the lab, there's so much more that goes into preserving those fossils, taking care of those fossils in the long run. Now here's a little picture of tapirs. So this is a living tapir. They're still alive today. Tapirs are certainly something Larissa knows well. She's one of the world fossil tapir experts. And the one we have from Gray is a dwarf tapir. So it's not a really large type of tapir, just a little cute one here to show you what they often look like when they're young. So overall, we represent the world's largest fossil tapir site in the world. We have over 100 individuals excavated so far, and many, many, many more to find. They are everywhere. So going back to that map I showed earlier, that aerial view map, remember all the dots were green before. Now what we've done is we've highlighted in red bones that are tapir bones. And so that gives you an idea of just how abundant they actually are. Dr. Richard Holbert from Florida is also a tapir expert. And so he was attracted and came up many times to study our tapir collection. And having a collection like this really allows you to study them in many different ways, looking at population characteristics. We also have a few relatively complete rhino skeletons. So not only do we have rhino, but we have some relatively complete skeletons. And this rhino was actually recently described as a new species of rhino. So it's not often that you find something like this as a large mammal new to science in the Pliocene. So about 5 million years ago, an entirely new species of rhino being discovered here. And again, we're finding relatively complete skeletons. This individual actually was the first relatively complete skeleton, and only one bone wasn't found. And that was a toe bone right here. Here's the real skull of that specimen. If you come and visit the museum, you can see a molded and casted representative of this rhino. We kept the canines, or we kept these tusks out, so they are available for study, and these are replicas that actually have now been painted. We also have horses. And when we think about late Miocene and early Pliocene in North America, there were lots and lots of different types of horses. And actually, what we can see is that way back in time, you had horses evolving and diversifying into different environments. And what this dark green is supposed to represent is more of a browsing type of setting or a forest type of setting. And then grasslands really start to develop in the Americas. And you have this great diversification of different types of horses along with these grasslands, till eventually you just get to the genus of horse that we have today, and a lot of these other ones go extinct. And so when you find horses at a fossil site, or I should say when you have a late Miocene early Pliocene site, people often ask, well, what all types of horses do you have? And the fact that we only have one, and it's more of a mixed feeder type of horse, is a reflection of the fact that our site really was a forested ecosystem at a time when a lot of other places were actually changing into prairies and plains types of sites. So our horse, we don't have much from the site. Red pandas, we don't know that our panda was red, but it's closely related. Our panda from the fossil site is closely related to the pandas, the red pandas of today. And so in 2003 or so, when Steve Wallace contacted me and I was at the University of Arkansas, he sent me this picture and said, what do you think it is? And this is an upper tooth. This is an upper cheek tooth. And I just wrote back and I said, well, it looks like a raccoon with some extra cusps. And he said, yeah, I know that's what it looks like. But I'm not sure what it is yet. And eventually he came to the conclusion that it was a type of red panda. And these are other types of red panda, including the living species here. And he was able to name it a new genus and species of panda based on that single tooth. And then more started to come in. And eventually we found a relatively complete skeleton in that back dirt pile that had come from underneath the museum, amazingly. We had these clay blocks that had been moved to the back, and as they weathered, that material came out, and the expertise of our preparators, like Sean Hagrud, put this thing back together again. And so these animals are coming from over here in Eurasia and actually, at some point in the past, migrating over into North America. We only had one other record in North America of this entire family, the Illyridae, and that was from Washington State. And now we have it from Washington State, and we have it from the Gray Fossil Site. They are completely different types of red panda fossils, and we have complete skeletons now. We have at least two individuals that are relatively complete. They can be compared to one another. And now we have one of those on exhibit actually at the Tennessee State Museum. So if you head over there, you can see that mounted. So there it is going back together again with our preparator putting it back together. This is a little bit of artwork that was done by one of my past students, Aaron Woodruff, showing a modern red panda here, and then how he envisioned our type of panda to have looked like in comparison. So larger bodied, longer limbed, not such a shortened muzzle. So it was different. It was different. Now bears are the group that I primarily work on, and short-faced bears are this group called the Tremarctines, and they show up at Gray and at a couple of other sites in North America, but we have a really good representative at Gray. And one of the first things that came out of the site was actually this jaw. And then we've gotten some other nice material as well. And when we look at early short-faced bears of this genus Paleontology, this is what some of the other specimens look like. And they've been named things like Paleontology edensis and Paleontology heraldorum. This is what we have from the Gray Fossil Site. Morphologically, it's similar, but there are some proportional differences that are distinct. And we're in the process of naming this as a new species. Certainly, this is the most complete Paleontology material known. We have some jaw fragments from some other sites out west, but now we have a relatively complete cranium from the site, and here it is right here, compared to Tremarctos, which is the living spectacled bear, or the Andean bear. And that is the only living Tremarctine. So it's not a very big type of bear. And actually I have one right back here. And the Gray Fossil Site one wouldn't have been much larger than this one. It actually would have been a similar size. But one thing to keep in mind with the Gray Fossil Site one, besides the fact that it's proportionally different, is that it's very, very small. And so these are permanent molars. This is the lower second molar in comparison to these other two members of the genus that have been described in the past. So you can see how distinctly different that is. Pass that one to this. Giant ground sloths are unusual. And if you've never found a giant ground sloth, then you still have a surprise waiting for you. If you learn osteology, if you learn about bones, and then you find something that you just can't identify because it's so bizarre and weird, what you need to think of first is the possibility that that could be some ground sloth material. And these ground sloths get in North America between 5 and 7 million years ago, before we even have a connection with South America, even though they're coming from South America. And the one we have from Gray is relatively small. Think of it as being about the size of a steer. But some of these giant ground sloths were incredibly large by the time we got into the Ice Age. We don't have very much from the Gray fossil site, just a few pieces, including this nice femur. If we were to name the Gray fossil site based on the abundance of animals, we would name it the tapirs and turtles site for sure, because we have so many of both of those. We get a lot of pond turtles like this that you see here, right here being excavated. The shells are still complete oftentimes. So we have sliders, musk turtles, snapping turtles, pond turtles, and some of these representatives are actually earliest members of these groups or new species. We have painted turtles, box turtles, an extinct type of tortoise. And actually this one is one that I got to work on with a colleague of mine, Jason Bork, where we were looking at musk turtles. And this one in particular ends up being a very early member of the group, sort of a stem member of this group, and we name it Sternothrus paleoodorus, which means old stinky. And that is in reference to the fact that they have these musk glands. We also have alligators. Our alligators are not particularly large. This is an alligator skull right here. Here's his right arm. You can see that all still in place as we were excavating it. There it is put back together again. There it is going back together. There it is a completed skull. Here it is in comparison to a modern alligator. And again, what we have is something that is a mixture of characteristics of modern alligator and extinct species. And so it has a mixture of characteristics, just like we would expect in an evolutionary setting. A unique thing that we do at this site is we actually do 100% screen washing. So everything is screen washed. And that means that we put the sediment into the screen, we wash it, and we pull out the small stuff. So here we use cattle troughs to do that. You dry the material, you screen wash it, and you look at it under microscopes to find those small bits and pieces that might be important. Snakes, salamanders. We have representatives of salamanders, many of which are the earliest members of those groups. So mole salamanders, different types of plethodontid salamanders that originally came from the Appalachians, many of these representing earliest members of these groups by millions of years. And so the preparation lab is a very active place. Again, this is a place where students from Vanderbilt have come and been able to get a lot of experience putting fossils back together, finding small fossils like many of these that you see here, bats and shrews that are from the site. And remember, you can find these small things and sometimes be really surprised by what you find. And what we actually have here are osteoderms. And osteoderms are bones from the skin. And what we have is fossil here and modern here. So this is an exterior view of this bone that was in the skin and an internal view, fossil, 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 fossil. And what does it actually represent? It actually surprisingly represented a venomous beaded lizard or Gila monster, which we were not expecting to find from the Gray fossil site. And the only thing we found of it are osteoderms, but that was enough to tell that we have this type of lizard. In 2015, we had some new and big news. And this was in the form of actually, for the first time, finding some of our elephant teeth. So when I say elephant, I'm referring to this bigger group called the proboscideans. And there are many types of proboscideans through time. And you might think of mammoths and mastodons, but there were many others as well. And as soon as we found these teeth, I rushed out to the site to look at them and was able to confirm that we had mastodon, not Gomphothere. They have a very different structure to their teeth, and it's easy to recognize one from the other. So Gomphotheres are what are often called false mastodons. That's what we have mounted there, and their teeth are different. they actually have these interior cusps between these major lobes as well. And you can see that here we don't have that. So mastodons are animals that have been around for a long time in North America, and they live all the way up through the Pleistocene and go extinct. But the gray fossil site mastodon is quite unusual and distinct, whereas the teeth look a lot like Ice Age mastodons. This front part of the jaw looks completely different. So this is a mastodon from the Ice Age. It isn't broken right here. This is actually what their jaw looks like. And then here is an early mastodon with this really elongated lower tusk, completely different, even though the teeth are essentially the same. There's a different type of early animal called a zygolophodon, which is sort of mastodon-like. And so just to give you a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about, these would basically be, this would be your Ice Age mastodon. This would be another form of proboscidean that was large at the time. And then this is probably somewhat what our mastodon looked like. And we're still putting it back together. We found it in 2015, or I should say we refound it in 2015. We've mostly finished excavating it, and we're putting it back together again. So I will stop there and answer any questions that you might have. I know I went a little bit long.
Okay, so we have a question here from Annie, and it's, did the tapirs die over time as a community, as a community live there over decades or all at once? And can you tell them?
So the tapirs are completely throughout the deposit. And so it's probably correct to say that in some cases you had more than one dying close to each other, or you could have had groups of them dying. But what we do know from tapirs is that they are relatively isolated in life. They don't really come together in big groups typically. And so for the most part, it was probably one individual every once in a while that didn't survive. And for some reason, even though they are incredible swimmers, didn't survive and sunk to the bottom.
Okay, we have one more question here. This is from Melissa Party. She said, great talk, exciting stuff. What is the age difference comparison between the red panda at the GFS and the one in Washington State?
Ah, good question. I think the one from Washington, well, actually, I don't know. I'm not going to guess on that because Steve Wallace is really the red panda expert, and he would have to look into that. I'm not sure how well dated the other site is, but I will say it's relatively close in time, relatively close in time. Now, the question that was asked about the tapirs and whether or not they may have been in groups when they died, that's still an important question that we need to pursue. And one of the things I do want to note is that with our new mastodon discovery, we are finding that multiple individuals were together, and that this could have actually been an event that killed a number of these mastodons.
Great, thank you. This question is from Dr. Simon Derrick, and he's asking, are the small mammal remains preserved loose in the matrix, or are they sort of part of a bird pellet or whatnot?
So everything is within the matrix, but the matrix isn't loose. And so, you know, a way to think about it is, you know, that this material is completely consolidated clay. And when we sort of shave up that clay, we're exposing it for the first time in 5 million years. And we actually can see that clay start to oxidize. And so it's a real anoxic setting. And we get these microfauna in particular areas that are more rich than other areas. So the microfauna isn't in great abundance everywhere, but it does seem to be distributed across the site. It isn't necessarily coming in from a raptor deposit, although in some ways it could be in some areas. We haven't found any evidence of etching or anything like that that you might get from a raptor though.
Great. So we have another question by Dr. Antonis Rokas, and his question is, the turnover in species composition between what was present 5 million years ago at the Gray site and what lives now in eastern Tennessee is striking. What were the contributing factors?
Great. So I want to mention two things, because one thing I didn't mention, I want to circle back around, is that sort of the geological way that the site forms. And we think that the site formed because of a sinkhole collapse. And so basically you would have had a cave system underneath this at some point, then it collapsed. But not only did it collapse and have this sort of big bowl-like feature, it filled in with water. And so animals that were coming in and died were those animals that were either attracted to the water or washed in one way or another. And so there's always this filter of what's going to be collected. And the Gray fossil site isn't collecting very much in the way of carnivorans, and it's very focused on animals that inhabit the water more. So we have very few representatives of animals that are more highly terrestrial, and more or higher representation of those like tapirs and water turtles that really, really like the water. So we always have to keep that in mind when we're making comparisons of species composition. Now, many things happened between the Gray fossil site and what we have in the modern biota. So tapirs, for example, lived perfectly fine and well up until the end of the Pleistocene, till about 11 to 12,000 years ago. We have tapirs in North America. So we're looking way back at 5 million years ago, but actually those tapirs continue to do just fine all the way up until the Pleistocene extinction, when mammoths and mastodons also go extinct. And so the end of, or this time frame in the Gray fossil site is capturing, isn't ending in an extinction event. Many of these animals continue on. The one that does disappear is the rhinos, and we represent one of the latest dates for rhinos, if not the latest date for rhinos in North America. And why they went extinct, we don't know. So that is up for, for questioning and for looking at whether or not some other animals replaced it as it went extinct. I'm not sure. And Larissa, feel free to jump in anytime you have thoughts on questions as well.
Well, I actually had a question a little bit on a different topic, which is you have this amazing fossil site, which is located in the Appalachians. And I know there's a lot of sort of pride in the Gray fossil site being in the backyard of many of the residents. At the same time, you're talking about, topics that aren't necessarily easily sort of accepted in this region. And so how do you kind of deal with that? How do you sort of, how have you found, what have been methods that you've used to effectively communicate science and the science of evolution in Tennessee?
So one of the things that we do is we exhibit to the public a working fossil site and what is coming out of the ground. And so it's undeniable. If you come to the museum, we are not digging up cows and sheep that we're finding from what Farmer John found, or threw into a sinkhole. And actually we had many people that thought that early on, but we're able to show people, the material coming out of the ground and then putting a rhino skull next to a fossil rhino skull and demonstrating fully how they are different. And that first message that you're able to teach is change over time, that there are extinctions, that there are these mass extinctions, and that you have to start putting things into a framework of time. So rhinos didn't make it into the Pleistocene. They go extinct way before. And so that leads to this discussion of geological time. And I think that's one of our major messages is change over time. It's right there. It's obvious that you can see this. There are alligators, there are tapirs, there are red pandas. And so if nothing else, people leave the museum saying, wow, okay, I need to think about this a little bit more because these animals are long gone, but they're clearly quite different than what we have today, not only here, but around the world. They're similar enough, though, to capture people's imagination. We don't have specific programs that teach evolution. but we do have a lot of programs that teach about change through time, which then leads to thinking about evolution. Of course, in our college classes, we're certainly using these specimens and fossils to talk about evolution, but the public programs that are developed around this is not necessarily coming from us, but schools do come and look at this, and they have lots of questions about how that then reflects on them and their place in the world. And I think getting families thinking about this is one of the best things that we can do as scientists in Tennessee and in the Appalachians.
Great, thank you. So there's another question that came in from Dr. Melissa Party, and she asked, do you have an idea of how much time is represented? Is it one relatively short period of deposition, or is it accumulating over time?
Great question. One of the things, Melissa, that we're not seeing is change in the animals or the plants through time. So we're not seeing any kind of depositional changes, and we're not really seeing any animal or plant changes from the top to the bottom yet. And that's based on excavations that we did under the museum and at the top of the hill. And so, we may be looking only at tens of thousands of years for the deposition of the fossil site itself. And we'll see as we move down through it whether or not that's correct. But right now, everything seems to be basically the same composition.
Great, thank you. Well, that's all of our questions. So I didn't know if you had anything else you wanted to add. I just went ahead and put the meeting link in the chat. It's also in your email for the virtual reception. And so what we'll do is in just a moment here, we will end the webinar and everyone can exit out. And then at 4:15, so you can take a little break, we'll recongregate for a virtual reception. So
Great.
thank you very much. And I would highly recommend checking out the Paleo Talk series if this was of any interest to you, which it was to me, and I know many of you. They're really quite fascinating. And I just also wanted to mention that Dr. Schubert's done an excellent job of making sure in that Paleo Talk series to feature, multiple career stages, men, women, diversity of speakers, which I think is really fantastic as well. So thanks to everyone who joined us, and thank you to Dr. Schubert for presenting. This was wonderful.
Thanks for having me.